Did you know Elvis Presley was terrified of the stage? For a man who defined what it meant to be a performer, he was filled with a paralyzing anxiety before every single show. The bigger the star, the bigger the fear. So, how did he do it? How did he walk out there night after night and become the king of rock and roll? He did it with rituals. Strange, specific, and non negotiable rituals. These weren't just quirks. They were a complex system of psychological armor he built around himself to survive the pressure. What did he need to have in his dressing room? What book did he read that changed his life? And why did he have to sing gospel music for an hour, sometimes making thousands of people wait, before he could sing a single note of rock and roll? The answers tell us more about the man than any of his hit records. Number 17. Why did a king need a choir before he could sing alone? It's almost showtime. The crowd is a rumbling beast on the other side of the wall, and you can feel the vibration through the concrete floor of the arena. Thousands of people are screaming for Elvis, but Elvis isn't listening. He's in a small, crowded room backstage, and he's singing. Not Hound Dog. Not Jailhouse Rock. He's singing How Great Thou Art. This was the most important ritual. Before Elvis could be the king of rock and roll, he had to be a humble gospel singer. He would gather his backup vocal groups like J.D. Sumner and the Stamps Quartet or the Imperials, and they would sing gospel music. This wasn't a quick vocal warm-up. It could last for an hour, sometimes longer. Joe Esposito, his road manager and closest friend, said in his book Good Rockin' Tonight that they would sometimes have to physically pull Elvis away from the gospel session to get him on stage. The audience could wait. This was more important. Why? It was his anchor. It was the one thing that connected him to his truest self. And Elvis grew up dirt poor in Tupelo, Mississippi. His family's life revolved around the Assembly of God Church. That's where he first learned to sing. The music, the passion, the call and response, it was baked into his DNA. Singing those hymns backstage wasn't a performance. It was a prayer. It was a way to center himself and find a moment of peace in the absolute chaos of his life. Psychologists call this kind of behavior anxiety reduction through ritual. A 2016 study in the journal Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society B found that rituals, even seemingly arbitrary ones, decrease anxiety by providing a sense of predictability and control. For Elvis, the world outside that room was a chaotic storm of fame, expectations, and pressure. Inside, singing those familiar songs with men he trusted, he was in complete control. He was just Elvis, the boy from Tupelo, singing to his God. J.D. Sumner, a legendary gospel-based singer with a voice so low it seemed to come from the center of the earth, was a father figure to Elvis. In interviews, Sumner often described these sessions as intensely spiritual. He said Elvis would get lost in the music, closing his eyes, sweat beading on his forehead, not as a superstar, but as a true believer. This wasn't for show. There were no cameras. It was real. It was his way of filling his spiritual tank before he went out on stage and poured every ounce of himself out for the crowd. So, when you see footage of Elvis on stage in the 70s looking like a demigod in his white jumpsuit, remember what happened just moments before. He was in a small room, harmonizing on a church song, trying to find the courage to face the thousands of people who saw him as a king, when all he really wanted in that moment was to feel like a child of God. But here's what we still don't know. Was this ritual purely spiritual, or did it become a crutch, a form of procrastination to delay the terror of walking on stage? Could he have performed without it, or had he so deeply linked the gospel singing to his ability to perform that one couldn't exist without the other? And was he singing to God, or was he trying to sing to his mother, Gladys, whose love for gospel music had started it all? Number 16, what was so important about cold air and ice water? The demands of a king can seem strange. For Elvis Presley, the temperature of his dressing room was not a suggestion. It had to be cold, not cool, cold. As in, meat locker cold. His Memphis Mafia, the nickname for his entourage, knew this was a top priority. As soon as they arrived at a venue, their first job was to get the dressing room down to a specific frigid temperature, often around 65 degrees Fahrenheit or even lower. They would bring in portable air conditioning units if the building system wasn't strong enough. Alongside this Arctic environment, there was another simple but rigid demand. Glasses of ice water. Not a pitcher, not bottles, multiple tall glasses filled to the brim with ice and then topped with water. They had to be waiting for them, condensation running down the sides. It was a very specific image, a very specific requirement. This wasn't just about comfort, it was part of the machinery of the performance. The jumpsuits he wore on stage in the 1970s were incredibly heavy. Made of wool gabardine and covered in metal studs and jewels, they could weigh up to 30 pounds. Under the intense heat of the stage lights, wearing one was like performing in a decorated sauna. The physical exertion of an Elvis show was immense. He moved constantly, kicking, punching the air, dropping to one knee. He would sweat so much that his friend and bodyguard Red West once joked they could wring out his jumpsuit and fill a bucket. The cold room was his pre-show charging station. It was a practical way to keep his body temperature down before subjecting it to the inferno of the stage. The cold would help prevent him from overheating too quickly once the show began. It was a physiological necessity born from the extreme demands of his own stagecraft. He created the spectacle, and then he had to create rituals to survive it. The ice water served a dual purpose. Of course, it was for hydration, but it was also a tool. Elvis used water constantly during the show. He would drink it, gargle with it, and splash it on his face. But the ritualistic part was having those specific glasses ready beforehand. It was a visual confirmation that everything was in its right place, that the world was ordered as it should be before he stepped into the chaos. In his book, Elvis, My Best Man, his longtime friend George Klein described how meticulous Elvis was about his surroundings. Everything had to be just so. This need for environmental control is a common trait among high performers who face unpredictable situations. A 2010 study published in the journal Science by psychologists Kristen Lauren, David K. Sherman, and Grain M. Fitzsimons showed that when people feel a lack of control in one area of their lives, they seek to assert control in other, more manageable areas. Elvis couldn't control the roar of 20,000 fans, but he could control the temperature of his dressing room. He couldn't control his nerves, but he could make sure his water was in the right kind of glass, with the right amount of ice. It was a small act of power in a life that was increasingly not his own. These rituals seemed minor, but they were the bedrock of his pre-show routine. They were the first things to be set up, and the last things to be checked. A room that was too warm or a lack of properly prepared ice water could create a sense of unease that would ripple through the entire pre-show process. It was his way of telling himself that his team was on top of things, that his world was secure, and that he was ready. But did he truly need the room to be that cold, or was the ritual more about testing the loyalty and efficiency of his crew? How much of this was practical need versus a psychological demand to see his orders followed perfectly? And if someone had failed, if the room was warm one night, would the king have refused to go on? Number 15, why did a superstar read a book meant for seekers? In the whirlwind of screaming fans, flashing cameras, and non-stop touring, Elvis Presley had a quiet, secret companion. It wasn't a person, it was a book, a thin, unassuming little volume with a profound title, The Impersonal Life. He didn't just read this book, he devoured it. He studied it, memorized passages, and gave away hundreds of copies to friends, family, and even complete strangers. It became a cornerstone of his spiritual life and a critical part of his pre-show ritual. Before facing the adoring masses, Elvis would often retreat to a quiet corner and read from this book. Its pages were his sanctuary. The Impersonal Life was first published anonymously in 1914, attributed only to the author. It was later revealed to be written by Joseph S. Benner. The book is a piece of spiritualist literature, written as if God is speaking directly to the reader in the first person. Its core message is about separating the ego, the personal self, from the true divine self, the impersonal I am, that is a part of God. For Elvis, a man whose personal self was one of the most famous and scrutinized on the planet, this message was a lifeline. The book told him that Elvis Presley, the superstar, the icon, was just a temporary vessel. The real power, the real talent, came from a higher source. This belief helped him cope with the crushing weight of being the king. It allowed him to see his talent not as a burden. He had to carry alone, but as a divine gift flowing through him. His hairdresser and spiritual confidant, Larry Geller, introduced him to the book in 1964. In his own book, If I Can Dream Elvis's Own Story, Geller describes how Elvis's face lit up as he read it for the first time. It articulated feelings and beliefs he had held since childhood but had never been able to put into words. From that day on, the book rarely left his side. He would read it before recording sessions, before movie shoots, and most importantly, before concerts. Reading The Impersonal Life was a ritual of psychological transference. He was transferring the responsibility for the performance from his anxious, mortal self to the divine, infallible power within. This is a powerful mental technique. It's similar to what athletes call getting in the zone, a state of peak performance where actions feel effortless and almost automatic. By telling himself that it wasn't him singing, but God singing through him, he could bypass his own fear of failure. He would talk about its concepts constantly with the Memphis Mafia. Jerry Schilling, a longtime friend, recalled in his memoir, Me and a Guy Named Elvis, how Elvis would try to explain the book's deep spiritual ideas to them, often with a childlike enthusiasm. He wanted everyone he cared about to understand the peace it had brought him. This ritual reveals the deep duality of Elvis's nature. On stage, he was the embodiment of ego and charisma. Backstage, he was a humble spiritual seeker, trying to dissolve that same ego by reading a book about surrendering to a higher power. He was a man who contained multitudes, the saint and the sinner, the king and the seeker, all at war within the same body. Reading this book was his way of calling a temporary truce before the battle of the show began. But we have to wonder, did the book truly bring him peace, or did it create a dangerous disconnect between the man and his actions? If he believed his talent and impulses came from a divine source, did that make it easier to excuse his own self-destructive behaviors? And ultimately, in his final years, was he still reading the book to connect with God, or was he desperately trying to find an excuse for the man he saw fading away in the mirror? Number 14. What power did a simple piece of jewelry hold? Elvis Presley loved jewelry, rings, bracelets, pendants, but one piece was different. It wasn't just decoration, it was a symbol, a mantra, and a critical pre-show talisman. It was his TCB necklace. The letters TCB stood for Taking Care of Business, a personal motto he adopted in the early 1970s. The logo, which he designed himself, featured the letters TCB above a lightning bolt. For Elvis, it meant getting things done professionally and efficiently. The lightning bolt signified in a flash. Taking care of business in a flash. He had these necklaces custom made in 14-karat gold for himself and his inner circle, the Memphis Mafia. It was their badge of honor, a symbol of their loyalty, and their place in the king's court. But for Elvis, his own TCB necklace was more than that. It was an object imbued with power. Just before he walked on stage, as part of his final sequence of rituals, he would hold the pendant in his hand. He would look at it, feel its weight, and often bring it to his lips for a quick kiss. This act was a moment of focus. It was a physical gesture that triggered a mental shift. It was his signal to himself that the time for reflection, for gospel singing, for quiet reading was over. It's time to become the man on stage. It was time to take care of business. This small, repetitive action is a classic example of what psychologists call an hankering technique. First described in the field of neuro-linguistic programming (NLP), anchoring involves associating a specific internal state like confidence or focus with a unique external trigger like a touch, a sound, or a visual cue. By repeatedly performing this gesture while in a state of pre-show focus, Elvis created a powerful psychological link. The touch of the cold metal, the sight of the familiar logo, the brief kiss, it all sent a message to his brain: it's showtime. It's similar to a baseball player tapping the plate with their bat or a basketball player bouncing the ball a specific number of times before a free throw. The ritual itself has no magic power, but the mental state it unlocks is very real. The TCB motto was born after his 1968 comeback special. That show reinvigorated his career and his passion for live performance. He was done with the cheesy movies and mediocre soundtracks. He was back in control, and TCB was the mission statement for this new phase of his career. So when he touched that necklace, he wasn't just performing a nervous tick. He was reconnecting with the spirit of that comeback, reminding himself of his power, his purpose, and his promise to his audience. His then-girlfriend, Linda Thompson, who was with him for much of the 70s, witnessed this ritual countless times. In interviews, she has described how Elvis's entire demeanor would shift in those final moments. He would go from being nervous and vulnerable to being intensely focused and powerful. The TCB necklace was a key part of that transformation. It was the switch that turned on the megawatt charisma the world came to see. It was his personal brand, his gang symbol, and his lucky charm all rolled into one. It represented his philosophy, his crew, and his commitment to putting on the best show possible. Kissing, it was a final, silent promise to himself and to the thousands waiting on the other side of the curtain. But what did taking care of business truly mean to him in his later years when his health was failing? Did the ritual become a hollow gesture, a reminder of a power he felt slipping away? And if he had ever lost that necklace before a show, would he have been mentally capable of walking on stage without it? What did the lightning bolt truly symbolize, a flash of divine inspiration or the rapid, destructive pace of his own life? Number 13. Why did the man who never stopped moving need to be perfectly still? The life of Elvis Presley was a blur of motion. Cars, planes, concerts, movie sets. He was always on the move, yet, in the hour before he was set to explode onto the stage in a frenzy of energy, he practiced a ritual of absolute stillness. Elvis had to have a nap. It wasn't a suggestion or a preference. It was a mandatory part of the pre-show schedule, timed with an almost scientific precision. After going through the initial stages of getting ready, he would lie down, fully dressed in his civilian clothes, and sleep. This wasn't a long, deep slumber. It was usually a power nap, lasting anywhere from 30 minutes to an hour. His road manager, Joe Esposito, was the keeper of the clock. It was his job to make sure Elvis was up at the exact right moment to begin the final phase of preparation getting into the jumpsuit. This ritual served a very practical purpose. Elvis's shows were incredibly demanding, both physically and vocally. They were high-energy sprints that left him drenched in sweat and utterly exhausted. The pre-show nap was a way to conserve every last ounce of energy for the performance. Think of it like an elite athlete resting before a major competition. In the 1970s, Elvis was often performing 2 shows a night in Las Vegas, a grueling schedule for any entertainer. The nap was not a luxury, it was a survival tool, but there was a deeper psychological layer to this ritual. The nap was a form of escape. In his book Elvis and the Memphis Mafia, author Alana Nash compiles the memories of his closest friends who described the immense pressure Elvis was under. The anxiety before a show was crippling. By sleeping, Elvis could achieve a temporary shutdown. For a brief period, he didn't have to be Elvis Presley. He didn't have to think about the thousands of screaming fans or the notes he had to hit. He could simply be unconscious, free from the burden of his own identity. This ritual highlights the paradox of his existence. He craved the adoration of the crowd, but the price of that adoration was a level of stress that was almost unbearable. The nap was his brain's emergency escape hatch. According to a 2015 study from the University of California, Berkeley, even a short nap can help to clear the brain of cluttered information and calm the nervous system, improving emotional regulation. For Elvis, napping was likely a self-prescribed method of managing his overwhelming performance anxiety. The waking up process was just as ritualized. Esposito would have to gently rouse him, carefully and quietly. A sudden or jarring wake-up could throw off his mood for the rest of an evening. Once awake, the energy in the room would shift dramatically. The period of quiet was over. The clock was ticking down the final minutes to showtime. The nap was the final moment of peace, the eye of the hurricane, before the storm of the performance was unleashed. It's a strange image to conjure. The king of rock and roll, a man famous for his gyrating hips and boundless energy, lying perfectly still in a quiet, cold room, gathering the strength to become himself. It shows the immense effort required to create the effortless-looking charisma he displayed on stage. The energy wasn't endless, it was a finite resource that had to be carefully managed and deployed. But what did he dream about during those precious minutes of sleep? Did he find peace, or was his subconscious filled with the same anxieties he was trying to escape? And as his reliance on prescription drugs increased, how much of this ritual was a natural nap, and how much was a medicated stupor he had to be pulled out of? Was he truly resting, or was he just shutting down? Number 12. Why did a singer need to fight before he sang? The energy in Elvis's dressing room before a show was a strange mix of quiet tension and explosive potential. One of the most bizarre rituals, one that seemed to come out of nowhere, involved a sudden burst of violence. Elvis, often with his bodyguards like Red West or his spiritual advisor Larry Geller, would practice karate. This wasn't a light stretching routine, it was full contact sparring with kicks, chops, and shouts filling the small space. Elvis fell in love with martial arts while he was in the army in Germany in 1958. He took it incredibly seriously, eventually earning an 8th degree black belt in Kempo Karate. It became more than a hobby. It was a philosophy and a discipline that he integrated into every aspect of his life, especially his stage performance. His famous 70s stage moves in, the deep lunges, the dramatic arm thrusts, the high kicks were all directly inspired by his karate training. The pre-show karate sessions were a way to bridge the gap between the private man and the public performer. It was a physical ritual that served multiple purposes. First, it was a fantastic warm-up. It got his blood pumping, stretched his muscles, and focused his mind. The intense physical activity was a release valve for the tremendous amount of nervous energy and adrenaline that was coursing through his veins. Instead of letting the anxiety eat him up inside, he could channel it outward into a controlled, powerful physical expression. Peter Guralnick, in his definitive biography, Careless Love, The Unmaking of Elvis Presley, describes how karate gave Elvis a sense of power and control that he felt was lacking in other areas of his life. In the controlled environment of a sparring session, he was the master. His movements were precise, his focus absolute. This feeling of mastery was something he could then carry with him onto the stage. This ritual also had a theatrical element. It was a way of getting into character. The sharp, aggressive movements of karate helped him tap into the primal, powerful persona of the king of rock and roll. He was, in a very real sense, doing a dress rehearsal for the physical ballet he was about to perform for the audience. He was waking up the Tiger Man persona that he famously sang about. Wayne Carman, a fellow martial artist and friend, often spoke of Elvis's dedication. He saw it as a spiritual practice, a form of moving meditation. For Elvis, karate was a way to unify his mind, body, and spirit. The shouts, or kiai, were not just for show, they were a way of focusing his energy and expelling his fear. So, while it may have looked to an outsider like a strange, violent outburst, for Elvis it was a centering, focusing ritual. It was the calm before the storm, created by a storm of his own making. Imagine the scene moments before he is to sing tender ballads like Can't Help Falling in Love. Elvis is practicing breaking boards or sparring with his bodyguards. It's another of the stark contradictions that defined him. He had to touch a part of himself that was aggressive and controlled in order to access the part that was vulnerable and charismatic on stage. But did these sessions ever get out of hand, blurring the line between a ritual and a real fight fueled by pre-show tension? How much was this about discipline, and how much was it about a man with a deep-seated anger needing a physical outlet? And did he see the audience as an opponent he had to conquer, just like a sparring partner in his dressing room? Number 11 was this just a grooming kit or a box of superstitions. Elvis Presley was famous for his looks. The hair, the sideburns, the clothes. His image was one of the most iconic of the 20th century. It should come as no surprise, then, that his grooming routine was an essential and unchangeable pre-show ritual. But it went beyond simple vanity. It was a meticulous process involving a specific set of tools that had to be laid out in the exact same way every single night. He had a traveling case, sort of mobile vanity that, contained everything he needed. This wasn't just any collection of toiletries, it was his personal, almost sacred grooming kit. Inside were specific brands of hairspray, makeup, cologne, and hairbrushes. According to members of the Memphis Mafia, if a particular item was missing, or worse, if a different brand was substituted, it could cause genuine distress. The ritual began with his hair. Larry Geller was his primary hairstylist in the later years. The process of combing, teasing, and spraying that famous black pompadour was a slow and deliberate art. It required a specific comb, a specific brush, and a can of hairspray held at a precise distance. This wasn't just about looking good, it was about constructing the public face of Elvis. It was the first layer of his performance armor, then came the makeup. In the 70s, he wore a surprising amount of it for the stage. The hot lights would wash out his features, so he used eyeliner to define his eyes and makeup to even his skin tone. Again, the products had to be the ones he was used to. The application was a quiet, focused part of the routine. This obsessive need for consistency is a hallmark of superstitious or ritualistic behavior. A 2013 study by researchers at the University of Cologne showed that engaging in rituals can lead to a belief that one has more control over external events, which is why they are so common in high-stakes situations like sports or performing. For Elvis, having the exact right brand of hairspray was not about the hairspray itself. It was about certainty. In a world full of variables to the sound system, the audience's mood, his own health, the grooming kit was a constant. It was a patch of solid ground in a shifting landscape. His friend Joe Esposito confirmed that this was not a flexible part of the routine. The kit was checked and double-checked before every trip. It was a self-contained world of familiarity that traveled with him from city to city. When he sat down in front of that mirror and saw the familiar jars and brushes laid out in their proper places, it sent a signal to his brain that everything was okay, that the night was starting off correctly. Any deviation could plant a seed of doubt that things might go wrong. Think about it. He was a man who had lost all semblance of a normal life. He couldn't go to a store, he couldn't walk down the street. The items in this grooming kit were some of the only consistent personal objects in his life. They were his tools, not just for his image, but for his sanity. The ritual of applying them was a quiet, meditative act of creation, the creation of the icon. But where is the line between a routine and a compulsion? Did he believe that using the wrong brand of eyeliner could actually cause him to have a bad show? As his dependency on other, more dangerous substances grew, was the rigid control over his grooming kit an attempt to feel in control of a body that was increasingly betraying him? And what did he really see when he looked in that mirror after the mask was perfectly applied? Number 10, why did the King of Noise demand absolute silence? The sound of an Elvis concert was deafening. The music, the screaming, the applause. It was a wall of noise, but in the final minutes before he stepped into that wall of sound, Elvis demanded the opposite. He required absolute total silence. This wasn't a casual, hey, keep it down request. It was a strict, unbendable rule. As showtime approached, the energy backstage would reach a fever pitch. Friends, musicians, and local dignitaries would often be crowded into the dressing room area. But when the signal was given, usually by his father, Vernon, or his manager, Colonel Tom Parker, a hush would fall over the entire area. Everyone had to stop talking. All movement would cease. The only sound was the faint, distant roar of the crowd. Elvis would use this time for a final moment of intense private focus. He would pace, he would sit, he would stare at his own reflection in the mirror. He was gathering his thoughts, centering his energy, and mentally preparing for the explosion of activity to come. The silence was a vacuum he created, pulling in all his focus and power before releasing it on stage. This ritual of silence is a powerful psychological tool. It's a form of meditation. In a 2013 study, researchers found that even 2 minutes of silence can be more relaxing than listening to relaxing music due to its ability to lower blood pressure and heart rate. For Elvis, whose heart was likely pounding with a mixture of fear and excitement, these moments of imposed quiet were a way to regulate his own physiology. He was manually lowering his own anxiety levels. Jerry Schilling, in Me and a Guy Named Elvis, described the intensity of these silent moments. He said you could feel the energy in the room crackling. It was a sacred time, and everyone understood the importance of respecting it. To speak during this time was the ultimate sin. It would shatter the fragile bubble of concentration Elvis was building around himself. This ritual also served to heighten the drama of the moment. The stark contrast between the complete silence backstage and the roaring chaos just a few feet away created a powerful sense of anticipation. It was the deep breath before the plunge. For Elvis, it was the final opportunity to be alone with his thoughts, even in a room full of people. He was sealing himself off from all external distractions, preparing to enter a state of pure performance. It's a testament to his authority that he could command this level of silence from a large group of people with just a look. It shows the respect and perhaps the fear he inspired in his own entourage. They knew this wasn't a game. His ability to perform, to be the man everyone came to see, depended on these strange, specific rituals. The silence was the final ingredient in the complex cocktail of preparation. It was the quiet space where Elvis Presley, the man, died for a few hours, and Elvis Presley, the legend, was born. But what was he thinking about in that deafening silence? Was he praying? Was he running through lyrics? Or was he simply trying to quiet the voice of his own fear? And what would have happened if someone had broken that silence at a critical moment? Would the rage and frustration have carried over onto the stage? Or would the spell have been broken completely? Number 9, what was the secret language of the scarves? One of the most iconic images of Elvis in the 1970s is of him on stage draping a sweat-soaked scarf around the neck of a screaming female fan. He gave away thousands of these scarves throughout his career. They were a key part of the concert experience. But before they could become souvenirs for his adoring public, the scarves were part of a meticulous and unchanging backstage ritual. The scarves, usually silk and in a variety of colors, were not just thrown in a box. They had to be prepared. Before each show, a member of the crew, often his friend and aide Charlie Hodge, had a specific job to untie the knots from the manufacturer, fold each scarf into a neat square, and then soak them in water. After being soaked, they were placed in a cooler, ready to be taken to the stage. Why this elaborate process? It served several practical purposes. The water made the scarves cool, providing Elvis with some relief from the intense heat of the stage lights. Wiping his brow with a cool, damp scarf felt good. The moisture also gave the scarves a bit of weight, making them easier to throw and control as he tossed them into the audience. A dry, flimsy silk scarf would just float aimlessly, but beyond the practical, this was a ritual of preparation, another box to be ticked on the pre-show checklist. Seeing the cooler full of neatly folded, damp scarves was a visual cue that a key component of the show was ready. And Charlie Hodge, who also played guitar and handed Elvis his water on stage, was the custodian of this ritual. His faithful execution of this task was part of the machinery that made the show run smoothly. This ritual also reveals something about Elvis's understanding of his own myth. He knew the scarves were more than just pieces of cloth. They were relics. They were a physical connection between the fan and the demigod on stage. By preparing them so carefully, he was, in a sense, blessing them before they were given out. He was ensuring that this important transaction with his audience would go off without a hitch. In her book, Elvis and Me, Priscilla Presley talks about how Elvis was obsessed with every detail of his image and his show. Nothing was left to chance. The scarf ritual was a microcosm of this obsession. It might seem like a small, insignificant detail, but for Elvis, the show was a sum of these details. A properly prepared scarf was just as important as a properly tuned guitar. Sociologist Emil Durkheim wrote about the power of collective effervescence, the feeling of energy and harmony when a group of people comes together for a shared purpose. The scarf giveaway was the peak of this experience at an Elvis concert. It was a moment of direct physical communion. The backstage ritual of preparing the scarves was the unseen work that made this moment of magic possible. It was part of the sacred duty of taking care of business. But did Elvis ever specify the exact temperature the water for the scarves should be? Was there a preferred method of folding that only Charlie Hodge knew? And as he tossed them into the crowd night after night, did he see the faces of the individuals? Or did it all just become a blur, another part of the repetitive machinery of fame? Number 8, was it medicine or was it a magic potion? This is the darkest and most controversial of all of Elvis's pre-show rituals. It is also the one that ultimately destroyed him. In the final years of his life, a critical part of his preparation for a show was a carefully administered cocktail of prescription drugs. This wasn't a secret. It was a routine managed by his doctor, George Nicopolis, known as Dr. Nick, and administered by members of his inner circle. The ritual involved what were called attack packs. These were small envelopes containing a specific combination of medications to be taken at specific times before a show. The contents varied, but they often included uppers to give him the energy to perform, downers to calm his crippling anxiety, and powerful painkillers for his various chronic health issues. He suffered from glaucoma, an enlarged colon, and other ailments that caused him constant pain. To Elvis, these drugs were not a vice. They were a necessity. In his mind, they were the medicine he needed to do his job. The show had to go on, and if it took a handful of pills to get him out on that stage, then that was what he would do. The ritual was precise. A dose at 1 hour before the show, another at 30 minutes, perhaps another just moments before walking out. It was a chemical countdown, a way of building an artificial version of the energy and charisma he once had naturally. In the 2018 documentary Elvis Presley: The Searcher, you can see the tragic effects of this ritual. In some of his last performances, he is bloated, sweaty, and slurring his words, a shadow of his former self. Yet, the show goes on. The ritual was followed, even when it was clear it was killing him. Why did he need this? The pressure was immense. By the mid-70s, he was trapped in a grueling schedule of touring and Las Vegas residencies, a schedule dictated by the financial needs of his manager, Colonel Tom Parker. He was physically and emotionally exhausted. His body was failing him. The drugs were a crutch that allowed him to keep going, to continue being the superstar everyone expected him to be. Psychologically, this ritual is a tragic example of state-dependent learning. His brain began to associate the act of performing with the presence of these chemicals. He may have come to believe, on a deep level, that he was incapable of performing without them. The ritual wasn't just about managing pain or anxiety anymore, it was about creating the Elvis persona itself. The real man was too tired, too scared, and in too much pain. The drugs helped build the illusion. His Memphis Mafia was caught in an impossible position. In various books and interviews, they described their helplessness. They were trying to manage the dosages to keep him alive, but they were also employees who knew that their livelihoods depended on Elvis getting on that stage. The ritual of the attack packs was a grim, necessary evil in their world. This wasn't a simple case of addiction. It was a complex tragedy involving chronic pain, severe anxiety, professional pressure, and a medical system that enabled his dependency. The ritual of taking his pre-show medication was the final, desperate act of a man trying to hold himself together long enough to give his fans one more night of magic. But here is the most chilling question. Did anyone ever try to stop the ritual, to refuse to give him the pills and risk canceling a show? Was there a point of no return where Elvis himself knew the ritual was killing him, but felt powerless to stop it? And if he had been able to get on stage without the drugs, what would have been there instead? A lesser performance, or a more honest, vulnerable, and perhaps even greater one? Number 7. Why did a pool table belong in a dressing room? An arena dressing room is usually a functional, sterile space. But if you were backstage with Elvis in the 70s, you might find a strange addition, a bumper pool table. And bumper pool is a variation of pool played on a smaller, often octagonal table with fixed obstacles bumpers in the middle. For Elvis, a pre-show game was a frequent and important ritual. He had tables installed in his homes, and a portable one often traveled with him on tour. Playing a game of bumper pool was a way to distract himself from the mounting pressure of the performance. It was a form of active meditation. Unlike passively watching TV, the game required just enough focus and light physical activity to occupy his mind and keep the anxiety at bay. It was a way to kill time, but in a structured, engaging way. He would play with anyone who was around his father, Vernon, members of the band, or his friends from the Memphis Mafia. The games were usually lighthearted and filled with the kind of playful banter and inside jokes that defined the group's dynamic. This was a crucial part of the ritual. It was about connection and camaraderie. In these moments, playing a simple game, he wasn't the lonely king. He was just one of the guys, laughing and competing over a silly shot. This sense of normalcy was a precious commodity in his isolated world. Dr. Stuart Brown, founder of the National Institute for Play, has written extensively about the importance of play for adults. In his book, Play: How It Shapes the Brain, Opens the Imagination, and Invigorates the Soul, he argues that play is not a frivolous activity, but an essential biological need for managing stress and fostering social bonds. Elvis's pre-show bumper pool games are a perfect illustration of this concept. He was self-prescribing a dose of play to counteract the immense stress of his work. This ritual also speaks to his competitive nature. Elvis was an alpha male and loved to win, even at a game of bumper pool. The small victories of the game could provide a little boost of confidence before he had to go out and conquer a stadium full of people. It was a low-stakes way to get his competitive juices flowing. The bumper pool table was a piece of home that he could take with him on the road. It was familiar, the sound of the balls clicking together, the feel of the cue in his hand. It was another sensory anchor, like the specific brand of his hairspray or the cold glass of ice water. It was a ritual that helped make the sterile, anonymous environment of a different arena every night feel a little more like his own space. It was a way of marking his territory. So while the gospel singing fed his soul and the karate focused his body, the bumper pool game served to calm his mind and reinforce his social bonds. It was another piece of the intricate puzzle he had to assemble before he was whole enough to walk out on stage. It was a moment of structured, playful distraction before the serious business of the show began. But who did he most enjoy playing against, and why? Was the game truly about fun, or was it another subtle test of loyalty to see who would let him win? And if he lost the game just before a show, did that small defeat ever affect the confidence he projected on stage? Number 6, what? Was the secret behind the smell of a sick room? Of all the strange pre-show rituals, this one might be the most peculiar and sensory. Before a show, Elvis would often open a jar of Vicks VapoRub and inhale the strong medicinal scent of menthol and camphor. Sometimes he would even have a small amount rubbed on his chest or dabbed under his nose. For decades, people have used VapoRub to relieve coughs and congestion. But For Elvis, this was not about treating a cold. It was a vocal and psychological tool. As a singer, his voice was his life. Any congestion or stuffiness could be disastrous for a performance. The powerful vapors from the Vicks would help open up his nasal passages and sinuses, allowing him to breathe more freely. Inhaling the steam from a bowl of hot water with vapor rub dissolved in, it was a common singer's trick, and Elvis adopted a more direct version of it. It was a practical way to ensure his vocal instrument was as clear as possible before he had to use it for 2 hours straight. But the ritual went deeper than just its physical effects. The sense of smell is powerfully linked to memory and emotion, a phenomenon known as the Proust effect, named after the author Marcel Proust. A specific scent can trigger vivid, emotional memories from the past. The smell of Vicks VapoRub is a very common childhood scent for many people, associated with being sick and being cared for by a parent. For Elvis, who was intensely close to his mother, Gladys, who died in 1958, this scent may have been a powerful subconscious link to a time when he felt safe and looked after. The medicinal smell could have provided a strange sort of comfort, a sensory reminder of his mother's care. In the high-stress environment of a backstage arena, this small familiar scent could have been a grounding force, a fragment of his childhood he could hold on to. This ritual was something he did in private. It wasn't a performance for others. It was a personal moment, a quiet interaction with a simple, common product. This suggests its importance was more internal than external. While the karate and the gospel singing were shared activities, the Vicks inhalation was a solitary act. It represents his deep-seated hypochondria and his constant anxiety about his health and his voice. He was always searching for a remedy, a magic potion, that would guarantee he could perform. He carried a small pharmacy of throat lozenges, sprays, and remedies with him. The Vicks VapoRub was the most consistent and perhaps the most comforting of them all. It was a tangible, physical thing he could do to feel like he was taking control of his vocal health. It was part science, part superstition, part psychological comfort, so when you picture him in his glittering jumpsuit, about to walk on stage, add this strange detail, the powerful medicinal smell of menthol filling his lungs. It was the scent of a sick room, used as a tool to bring a stage and thousands of people to life. But what was the specific memory, if any, that this scent triggered for him? Was it a comfort, or was it a sad reminder of his mother's own failing health? And in his later years, when his body was truly failing, did the scent of Vicks become a desperate plea for a cure that no medicine could provide? Number 5, why would he not want to see the woman he loved? By the 1970s, Elvis's marriage to Priscilla was over. His most significant romantic partner during his touring years was Linda Thompson. She was a constant presence in his life, living with him at Graceland and traveling with him on the road. He clearly loved and depended on her, yet there was a strict and unbreakable rule. In Linda, like Priscilla before her, was not allowed to be in the dressing room or even be seen by Elvis in the final moments before a show. This wasn't a personal rejection, it was a compartmentalization of his life that he felt was absolutely necessary for his performance. The dressing room was a masculine-focused, almost sacred space. It was the zone where he transformed from a private individual into a public icon. In his mind, the presence of a romantic partner, a symbol of his domestic, private life, would break that spell. In her own memoir, A Little Thing Called Life, Linda Thompson describes this ritual. She would have to say her goodbyes to him earlier in the evening. Then, she would be escorted to her seat in the audience, and she would not see him again until after the show was over. He needed to maintain a complete and total focus on the task at hand. He saw the performance as a battle, and the dressing room was the armory. The presence of his girlfriend would be a distraction, a reminder of a softer, more vulnerable part of himself that he needed to suppress in order to become the swaggering king on stage. This ritual speaks volumes about Elvis's views on gender and his own identity. He divided his world into separate spheres. The world of women, love, and home was one thing. The world of men, work, and performance was another, and the two could not mix. This was a common mindset for men of his generation, but Elvis took it to an extreme. There might also have been a layer of superstition to it. Many performers and athletes have superstitions about a loved one's presence affecting their performance. For Elvis, keeping Linda at a distance was part of the formula for a good show. Her being in the audience was fine, but her being backstage was a violation of the established successful ritual. Why risk changing a formula that worked? This separation also protected him. On stage, he was a sexual icon, singing love songs and interacting with his female fans. To have his actual partner watching from the wings might have felt inhibiting. He needed to be completely free on stage to be the fantasy version of Elvis. To do that, he had to temporarily forget the reality of his personal life. He needed to be single for the 2 hours he was on stage. It was part of the illusion he was selling. This ritual created a strange dynamic. The person he was closest to in the world was excluded from the most important moments of his professional life. It shows the incredible loneliness at the heart of his fame. Even when surrounded by people, he had to create a zone of isolation to do his job. He had to push away the love and comfort of a partner to be able to project an image of love and charisma to thousands of strangers. But did he ever break this rule? And what happened if he did? Did Linda Thompson ever resent this exclusion, or did she understand it as a necessary part of the job? And does this ritual reveal a deeper fear of intimacy, a need to keep even the people he loved most from seeing the fragile, terrified man behind the curtain? Number 4, why did a rock star need a classical composer's introduction? The show is about to begin. The house lights go down. The arena is plunged into darkness. A wave of screams erupts from the crowd. And then the music starts. But it's not a guitar riff. It's not a drum beat. It's the thunderous, earth-shaking sound of a classical orchestra. The opening fanfare of Richard Strauss's Also Sprach Zarathustra. Most people know it as the theme from the 1968 film, 2001: A Space Odyssey. For Elvis fans, it meant only one thing: the king was about to appear. This opening was not just music. It was a ritualistic cue, the final signal before Elvis made his entrance. He would not move, would not walk towards the stage until he heard those first powerful notes. The choice of this specific piece of music was a stroke of genius, likely from Elvis himself, who loved the film. The music is grand, epic, and almost religious in its tone. It creates a sense of immense anticipation and importance. It doesn't introduce a singer, it announces the arrival of a messiah. The ritual was the same every single night. The band would be in place, the orchestra would be ready, Elvis would be waiting in the wings, often with his bodyguards forming a human shield around him. He would be in his final state of concentration, listening. As soon as the first notes of Zarathustra hit, that was the trigger. It was the bell for the fight. It was the point of no return. The entire pre-show process, all the other rituals led to this single moment. This choice of music fundamentally changed the nature of a rock concert. Before this, bands would just walk on stage and start playing. Elvis turned his entrance into a theatrical, almost mythological event. The music elevated him from a mere entertainer to a larger-than-life figure. It was a deliberate act of self-mythologizing. The composer Strauss was inspired by Friedrich Nietzsche's philosophical novel of the same name, which deals with the idea of the Übermensch or Superman. It's hard to imagine a more fitting theme for a man called the King. This ritual also served as a powerful audio cue for Elvis himself. Just as the TCB necklace was a physical trigger, the Zarathustra theme was an auditory one. When he heard that music, his brain knew it was time. The adrenaline would surge. Any remaining fear had to be pushed aside. The music was so loud and overwhelming that it likely drowned out his own internal monologue of anxiety. It was a wave of sound. He could ride onto the stage. The members of his TCB band, like guitarist James Burton and drummer Ronnie Tutt, have spoken about the power of that opening. From their position on stage, they would feel the physical impact of the sound and see the explosion of light from thousands of camera flashes as Elvis appeared. The Zarathustra theme was the fuse that lit that explosion night after night. It was the perfect dramatic bridge from the silence of backstage to the pandemonium of the show. It was the final piece of his psychological armor. He had centered his spirit with gospel, focused his body with karate, and calmed his nerves with silence. The Strauss theme was the signal that the transformation was complete. The man was gone, and the icon was taking the stage. But whose idea was it originally to use this specific piece of music? Did Elvis understand the deep philosophical connections to Nietzsche's Superman, or did he just think it sounded cool and epic? And if the tape had ever failed to play, would he have been able to walk on stage in silence? Or was the sound of Zarathustra the only key that could unlock the door to the stage for him? Number 3, what did he see in his own reflection? The final moments before Elvis walked on stage were a study in focused intensity. He had gone through all the other rituals, the gospel singing, the karate, the nap, the silence. He was in his jumpsuit. The Zarathustra theme was about to begin, but there was one last, crucial ritual he had to perform. It was a silent, intense confrontation with his own reflection in a full-length mirror. This wasn't a quick, vain glance to check his hair, it was a deep, penetrating stare. Those who witnessed it, like his friend Jerry Schilling, described it as if he were looking through the mirror, not just at it. He would stand there, stock still, for what felt like an eternity, his eyes locked on the image of the man in the jumpsuit. He was not admiring himself, he was psyching himself up. He was having a final silent conversation with the person he was about to become. This act of mirror gazing, or scrying, has a long history in psychology and mysticism. In modern terms, it's a powerful technique for self-affirmation and focus. By staring at his reflection, Elvis was solidifying the persona he was about to project. He was seeing himself not as the nervous private man, but as the confident, powerful king the audience was waiting for. It's a technique similar to what method actors do to get into character. He was looking at Elvis the performer until Elvis the man disappeared. A 2015 study published in the journal Personality and Social Psychology Bulletin found that athletes who use self-talk and visualization techniques imagining a successful performance performed better under pressure. Elvis's mirror ritual was a non-verbal form of this. He was visualizing the man he needed to be. He was affirming his own power, his own charisma, his own identity as the greatest entertainer in the world. There was also an element of a warrior preparing for battle. The jumpsuit was his armor. The mirror was his final check before heading into the arena. He was looking for any sign of weakness, any flicker of fear in his own eyes, and extinguishing it. He was hardening himself, building a wall between his vulnerable inner self and the demanding outside world. It was a moment of intense self-creation. In the later years, this ritual must have taken on a tragic, poignant quality. As his health declined and his body changed, the reflection in the mirror was no longer the sleek, dangerous rock star of 1968. It was a bloated, tired man, held together by drugs and a corset under his jumpsuit. The mirror confrontation in those years must have been less about affirmation and more about defiance. He was staring down his own decline, daring himself to go out and be great one more time, despite the evidence in the mirror to the contrary. This ritual was the most private of all. It was a silent conversation to which no one else was privy. It was the final seal on the transformation. After that long, hard stare, he would turn away from the mirror, and he would be ready. The next face he would look at would be the thousands in the crowd. The man in the mirror was gone. The king was here. But what was he actually saying to himself in his head during those silent moments? Was he giving himself a pep talk, or was he praying for the strength to get through the show? And in his last years, did he ever feel like the man in the mirror was a stranger, a costume he could no longer fill? Did he ever see a ghost looking back at him? Number 2, why did the loneliest man in the world have to walk alone? The transformation was complete. The final check in the mirror was done. The opening notes of Also Sprach Zarathustra were shaking the building. It was time. But the final steps of the journey, the short walk from the dressing room to the stage, had its own strict and lonely ritual. Well, Elvis had to walk it alone. This might sound strange, as he was constantly surrounded by his entourage. But for this final walk, the Memphis Mafia would part like the Red Sea. They would walk ahead of him or behind him, forming a protective bubble, but he would walk in the center of that bubble, by himself. No one was to touch him. No one was to speak to him. He was in the zone, and that zone was a solitary space. This ritual was the final physical act of separation. He was separating himself from his friends, his support system, and stepping into his role as the singular focus of thousands of people. The walk was a symbolic journey from the private world to the public one. It was a short, dark tunnel he had to navigate by himself before emerging into the blinding light of the stage. Joe Esposito and other members of his crew have described this walk as the most intense moment of the entire night. The energy coming off of Elvis was palpable. He would be completely focused, his eyes looking straight ahead, his face a mask of concentration. He was no longer one of the boys, he was the main event. The ritual of walking alone reinforced this shift in status. It was a non-verbal declaration that for the next 2 hours he was on a different level from everyone else. This behavior is seen in many top performers. Think of a boxer walking to the ring with his trainers and cornermen around him, but not with him. He is in his own world. This psychological isolation is a way of conserving mental energy and maintaining focus. Any small talk or physical contact could break the fragile state of concentration he had spent the last few hours building. This ritual is the ultimate paradox of Elvis's life. He was arguably one of the most loved and adored people on the planet. Millions of people felt they knew him. Yet, in the moment before he received that adoration, he had to be completely and utterly alone. The loneliness of fame is a well-known cliché, but Elvis lived it in a very literal way every single night. The final walk to the stage was a physical manifestation of his isolation. It also protected his mystique. The audience saw him appear as if from nowhere, a magical figure emerging into the light. The reality was a nervous man, walking down a concrete hallway. But the ritual of the solitary walk helped maintain the illusion. It was part of the theater of the event. Imagine the scene. The roar of the crowd is getting louder with every step. The lights of the stage are just ahead. He is surrounded by the men he trusts most in the world, yet he is in his own universe, untouchable. It was the last moment of peace, the last moment of being with his own thoughts before he gave himself completely to the audience. It was the lonely path every king must walk to his throne. But did he choose this solitude, or did it choose him? Was there ever a night he was so scared that he wanted to grab a friend's arm but couldn't because the ritual forbade it? And what did that short walk feel like? A triumphant march to glory or a condemned man's final walk to the gallows? Number one, was he performing for the audience or for his dead brother? This isn't a pre-show ritual you will find on any checklist. It wasn't something Elvis did with his hands or his voice. It was a deep psychological ritual that existed in the background of every performance he ever gave. It was his lifelong connection to his identical twin brother, Jesse Garon Presley, who was stillborn 35 minutes before Elvis was born on January 8th, 1935. Elvis grew up as an only child, but he always felt the presence of the brother he never knew. His mother, Gladys, often told him that when one twin died, the surviving one received all the strength of both. This idea became a core part of Elvis's personal mythology. He believed he was living for two people. His incredible energy, his talent, his ambition, he felt it was not just his own, but Jesse's as well. This created a powerful, lifelong psychological dynamic. In his definitive biography, Last Train to Memphis, Peter Guralnick explores how this twinless twin identity shaped Elvis's entire life. He had a profound sense of survivor's guilt, but also a feeling of being special, of being chosen. He would often talk to his brother at his grave. He felt his brother's presence constantly. So, how was this a pre-show ritual? Every time Elvis prepared to go on stage, he was preparing to live up to the immense expectation of being the one who lived. The pressure to succeed was not just for himself, but for the brother who never had a chance at life. The performance was not just a show, it was a justification of his own existence. He had to be great enough for two people. This internal, unspoken ritual fueled his incredible drive. It may also have been the source of his deepest insecurities and his crippling stage fright. How could any mortal man live up to the task of fulfilling the destiny of two souls? The need to be perfect, to be loved by everyone, was not just professional ambition. It was a way of assuring the ghost of his brother and himself that his life had been worth the trade. Dr. Peter Whitmer, a psychologist who wrote the book The Inner Elvis, a psychological biography of a twinless twin, argues that this was a central drama of Elvis's life. The constant need for an audience, the creation of a loyal entourage like the Memphis Mafia, to surround him at all times, it was all an attempt to fill the void left by his missing twin. He could never truly be alone. This ritual had no physical form. It was not a prayer he recited or an action he took. It was a state of being. It was the lens through which he saw the world and his place in it. The gospel singing connected him to his mother and God, but the entire act of performing, of becoming Elvis Presley, was a lifelong ritual dedicated to Jesse. He was trying to shine brightly enough for the whole world to see, hoping that somewhere his brother was watching. This puts all the other more bizarre rituals into a new context. The need for control, the superstitions, the crippling anxiety, it all makes more sense when you realize he was carrying the weight of two lives on his shoulders. Every show was a high-stakes offering to the memory of his brother. He wasn't just afraid of failing his audience, he was terrified of failing Jesse. But did he ever speak of this to his friends before a show? Or was this burden a completely private one? Did the pressure to live for two contribute to his self-destructive behavior as he tried to escape an impossible responsibility? And ultimately, when he was alone on stage, surrounded by thousands of fans, was he truly performing for them, or was he just a little boy from Tupelo trying to show his brother that he had made it?